Senator John Kennedy thought he could intimidate the new Congresswoman with his folksy Southern charm and sharp legal mind. The 72-year-old Louisiana Republican had destroyed countless witnesses in committee hearings with his trademark wit and Oxford-educated intellect. But when he tried to corner 43-year-old Jasmine Crockett in the House Judiciary Committee, he had no idea what was coming. What happened in the next 60 seconds left Kennedy completely speechless, and may have just launched Crockett into the national spotlight forever. The Texas Democrat didn't just defend herself. She delivered a comeback so savage, so perfectly timed that even Republicans in the room had to respect the hit. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these epic political moments. Trust me, you're going to want to see every second of what Jasmine Crockett just did to John Kennedy. The committee room fell dead silent. Kennedy, who had been leaning back in his chair with that confident smirk, suddenly sat up straight. His face went from amused to shocked in seconds. Even Chairman Jim Jordan, who never loses control of his hearings, looked stunned by what just happened. This wasn't just a political exchange. This was a generational clash that showed the old guard exactly what the new generation of leaders brings to the table. And John Kennedy just learned that lesson the hard way. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know who these two powerhouses really are and why this confrontation was always inevitable. John Kennedy isn't your typical Southern politician. Sure, he talks with that Louisiana drawl and loves his folksy sayings, but don't let that fool you. This guy graduated from Vanderbilt, earned a law degree from the University of Virginia, and got a Bachelor of Civil Law from Oxford University in England. He's been in politics for decades, serving as Louisiana's state treasurer before becoming a U.S. Senator in 2017. Kennedy built his reputation by absolutely destroying witnesses in committee hearings. His specialty, taking complex legal issues and breaking them down with simple, devastating questions that leave people scrambling for answers. He's made Supreme Court nominees sweat, reduced CEOs to stammering, and turned countless hearings into viral moments with his sharp wit. The man knows how to work a room. His colleagues respect his legal mind, even when they disagree with his politics. He's that dangerous combination of smart and folksy that makes him incredibly effective at making opponents look foolish. When Kennedy sets his sights on you in a hearing, most people know they're in trouble. But Jasmine Crockett isn't most people. The 43-year-old Texas Democrat came to Congress in 2023 with a fire that Washington hadn't seen in years. She's not just another politician. She's a civil rights attorney who spent years fighting in courtrooms before bringing that same energy to the House of Representatives. Crockett grew up in St. Louis, earned her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center, and built her career defending people who couldn't defend themselves. She worked on voting rights cases, fought against discriminatory practices, and developed a reputation for never backing down from a fight, no matter how powerful her opponent. When she won her seat representing Texas's 30th congressional district, Crockett made it clear she wasn't coming to Washington to play nice. She came to fight for her constituents and to challenge a system that had ignored voices like theirs for too long. Her colleagues quickly learned that this wasn't someone who would be intimidated by seniority or tradition. What made this confrontation so inevitable was the clash of everything these two represent. Kennedy embodies the old-school approach, experienced, calculated, using charm and intelligence to maintain control. Crockett represents the new wave, direct, passionate, unafraid to call out hypocrisy even when it's uncomfortable. The House Judiciary Committee had been tense all morning. They were discussing voting rights legislation, a topic that hits close to home for Crockett given her background as a civil rights attorney. Kennedy had been making his usual points about states' rights and federal overreach, using his trademark style to make the Democratic arguments seem unreasonable. But something was different this time. You could feel the tension building as Kennedy kept pushing, kept using that condescending tone that suggested he knew better than everyone else in the room. Crockett had been taking notes, waiting for her moment, and those who know her could see the fire building in her eyes. The stakes weren't just about this one hearing. This was about respect, about who gets to control the narrative, and about whether the new generation of leaders would let themselves be talked down to by the old guard. Both Kennedy and Crockett knew that millions would be watching the clips later, and both knew this moment could define how they're seen nationally. Kennedy had just finished a long speech about how federal voting rights legislation was unnecessary and how states could handle these issues themselves. He was in his element, talking about constitutional principles and legal precedents, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice. Then he made the mistake that would cost him everything. Instead of moving on to the next topic, Kennedy decided to go after Crockett personally. Maybe he thought she'd be an easy target, a freshman congresswoman who wouldn't dare challenge a senior senator. Maybe he was used to intimidating people with his credentials and experience. Whatever he was thinking, Kennedy was about to learn that Jasmine Crockett doesn't intimidate easily. And the entire room was about to witness what happens when someone with Kennedy's ego meets someone with Crockett's fire. The tension in the House Judiciary Committee room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chairman Jim Jordan was trying to keep the hearing on track, but you could feel something building. Senator Kennedy had been invited to testify as an expert witness on constitutional law, and he was clearly enjoying being the smartest guy in the room. Kennedy leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and delivered what he thought would be a knockout punch. His voice carried that slow, deliberate cadence that had intimidated countless witnesses before. "Miss Crockett," he began, using that tone teachers use when they're about to correct a student. "I appreciate your passion. I really do. But passion without understanding is just noise. Now, I've been studying constitutional law since before you were born, and I can tell you that what you're proposing here today shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how our federal system works." The Republican side of the committee started nodding. A few staffers in the back began taking notes, sensing this might be heading toward a viral moment. Kennedy was doing what he did, besuzzing his age, experience, and credentials to establish dominance. "You see," Kennedy continued, now fully in professor mode, "when you've been around as long as I have, when you've actually practiced law at the level I have, you understand that these issues aren't as simple as you young folks like to make them seem." The condescension was unmistakable. Even some of the Republicans looked uncomfortable with Kennedy's tone. Democratic committee members were exchanging glances, clearly frustrated, but unsure how to respond without seeming disrespectful to a senior senator. Crockett sat perfectly still, her pen poised over her notepad. But if you watched closely, you could see her jaw tightening. Her staff later said they knew that look. It was the same expression she got in court when opposing counsel made the mistake of underestimating her. Kennedy wasn't done. "Now, I don't mean to be disrespectful, Miss Crockett, but when you've graduated from Oxford, when you've served in the Louisiana legislature, when you've been practicing constitutional law for decades like I have, then maybe you'll understand why your proposal here is so problematic." That's when Kennedy made his fatal error. Instead of stopping with the condescension, he decided to go personal. "I mean, let's be honest here," Kennedy said, leaning back in his chair with that smirk that had made him famous. "You're a freshman congresswoman from Texas who spent her time doing small-time civil rights work. That's admirable. It really is. But it's not exactly the same as understanding how constitutional law works at the federal level." The room went dead quiet. Even the usual shuffling of papers stopped. Kennedy had just crossed a line that experienced politicians know you never cross, had dismissed not just Crockett's position, but her entire career and qualifications. What Kennedy didn't realize was that he had just made the worst possible argument to the worst possible person. Jasmine Crockett had spent years fighting against exactly this kind of dismissive attitude. She had dealt with opposing counsel who thought they could intimidate her with their fancy degrees and prestigious firms. She had faced judges who questioned whether a black woman from Texas really belonged in their courtrooms. But this wasn't a courtroom where she had to be respectful to a judge. This was a congressional hearing where she was an equal member, and Kennedy had just made it personal. Crockett looked up from her notes for the first time since Kennedy started talking. The cameras caught the moment perfectly. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in her eyes that should have warned Kennedy he was in trouble. "Senator Kennedy," she said quietly, her voice so controlled it was almost scary, "I appreciate you sharing your resume with us. That's very helpful context." Kennedy smiled. Thinking he had won, he had no idea what was coming. "But since we're talking about qualifications and experience," Crockett continued, her voice still deadly calm, "let me make sure I understand your position correctly." She picked up a folder from her desk, a folder that everyone would later learn contained research her staff had prepared on Kennedy's own record. The Democratic side of the committee started paying closer attention. They could sense something was about to happen. "You're saying that my experience as a civil rights attorney fighting for voting rights in federal court doesn't qualify me to understand voting rights legislation. Is that correct?" Kennedy nodded, still confident. "Well, I'm saying there's a difference between local advocacy and understanding constitutional principles at the federal level. I see, Crockett said. And you're saying this because you have extensive experience with voting rights cases, among other things? Yes. That's when Crockett opened the folder. The camera zoomed in on her face, and for the first time since Kennedy started talking, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media. Crockett had done exactly what any good attorney does in court. She had let her opponent dig their own grave with their own words. Kennedy had established himself as the expert, dismissed her qualifications, and claimed superior knowledge. Now she was about to use all of that against him. The Republican side of the committee was starting to look nervous. They could sense the shift in energy, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on what was happening. Chairman Jordan tried to interject and move the hearing along, but Crockett wasn't done. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice now carrying the authority she had learned in courtrooms across Texas. "Since you've established yourself as the expert on constitutional law and voting rights, I'm sure you can help us understand something." Kennedy nodded, still not realizing he was walking into a trap. "Can you tell us about your record on voting rights cases? Specifically, how many voting rights cases you've actually argued in federal court?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Kennedy's smile started to fade as he realized where this was heading, but it was too late. Crockett had already lit the fuse. The moment of truth had arrived. Senator Kennedy, who seconds earlier had been the picture of confidence, now looked like a man who suddenly realized he had walked into quicksand. The slight hesitation in his response told everyone in the room that Jasmine Crockett had just landed a perfect shot. Kennedy cleared his throat. "Buying time. Well, my experience with constitutional law is broader than just voting rights cases specifically." But Crockett wasn't about to let him off the hook. She had spent too many years in courtrooms to let a witness wiggle away from a direct question. "I didn't ask about your broad experience, Senator. I asked specifically about voting rights cases in federal court. How many have you argued?" The cameras captured every micro-expression on Kennedy's face. The confident smirk was completely gone, replaced by the look of someone who knew they were in serious trouble. Republican committee members started shifting in their seats. Even Chairman Jordan looked uncomfortable. Crockett didn't wait for Kennedy to keep struggling. She looked down at her folder and delivered the blow that would end Kennedy's dominance in this hearing forever. "Let me help you out, Senator, since you seem to be having trouble remembering your voting rights experience. According to public records, you have argued exactly 0 federal voting rights cases. 0. The words hit like a sledgehammer. The Democratic side of the committee struggled to contain their reactions. A few staffers in the back couldn't hide their smiles. The Republican side looked like they wanted to disappear, but Crockett wasn't finished. She had learned long ago that when you have your opponent down, you don't let them get back up. "Now, since you brought up qualifications, let me share mine. I have personally argued 14 federal voting rights cases. 14. I've won jury verdicts protecting voting access. I've argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. I've spent the last 15 years of my career doing exactly the work we're discussing today." The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Kennedy, who had spent the last 10 minutes lecturing about experience and credentials, had just been exposed as having 0 practical experience in the exact area he was claiming expertise in. Meanwhile, Crockett, whom he had dismissed as doing small-time civil rights work, had extensive federal court experience. Kennedy tried to recover. "Well, my constitutional law experience is much broader." Senator Crockett interrupted, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had just completely reversed the power dynamic in the room. "With all due respect, you just spent 10 minutes telling this committee that my experience wasn't relevant because I was just doing small-time civil rights work. But it turns out that my small-time work includes more federal voting rights experience than you have." The silence in the room was deafening. Kennedy, who had built his reputation on making other people look foolish with pointed questions, had just been outmaneuvered by someone he thought would be an easy target. But Crockett had saved the best for last. She pulled out another document from her folder that her staff had prepared specifically for this moment. "And Senator, since you mentioned your impressive educational background, and it is impressive, I want to make sure we have all the facts on the table." Kennedy's face went pale. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. "You graduated from the University of Virginia Law School in 1977. That's 47 years ago. In those 47 years, voting rights law has evolved significantly. The Voting Rights Act has been amended. Supreme Court decisions have changed the landscape and new challenges have emerged. She paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final blow. Meanwhile, I graduated from law school in 2006 and have been actively practicing voting rights law ever since. So, while I respect your experience, Senator, when it comes to current voting rights challenges, the law as it exists today, and what actually works in federal court, I think my experience might actually be more relevant than yours. The transformation was complete. Kennedy, who had entered this exchange as the confident expert putting a young congresswoman in her place, now looked like a student who had been called out by the teacher. His famous wit had abandoned him. His folksy charm was nowhere to be found. He tried one last time to regain control. Miss Crockett, I think you're missing the broader constitutional principles. No, Senator, Crockett said firmly. I think you're missing the specific legal realities, and I think this committee deserves to hear from people who actually practice this law, not just people who talk about it. The Democratic side of the committee could barely contain themselves. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was caught on camera trying not to smile. Representative Jamie Raskin nodded approvingly. Even some of the Republican committee members looked impressed despite themselves. Chairman Jordan tried to move the hearing along, clearly uncomfortable with how thoroughly one of his star witnesses had been dismantled. But the damage was done. In the span of 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had completely reversed the power dynamic and shown the entire room what happens when someone underestimates her. For the remaining 20 minutes of the hearing, Kennedy was a different person. Gone was the confident professor lecturing about constitutional law. Instead, he gave brief, careful answers and avoided making eye contact with Crockett. When Chairman Jordan asked if he had any closing thoughts, Kennedy simply said, "No, I think I've said enough." The cameras caught everything. Kennedy's complete transformation, from confident expert to deflated witness. The moment when he realized he had been outplayed. The look on his face when Crockett delivered her final devastating point about whose experience was actually more relevant. Even before the hearing ended, clips of the exchange were going viral. The contrast between Kennedy's arrogant setup and Crockett's devastating response was perfect for social media. Hashtag Jasmine Destroys Kennedy started trending within an hour. The most shared clip was the moment when Crockett revealed Kennedy's 0 federal voting rights cases compared to her 14. The second most shared was her final point about whose experience was actually more relevant. Both clips would eventually be viewed millions of times. But the real viral moment was the visual of Kennedy's complete transformation. Political observers noted that they had never seen the usually unflappable senator so thoroughly outmaneuvered. One Twitter user perfectly captured the moment. John Kennedy just learned why you don't bring a law degree to a courtroom fight. As the hearing concluded, the change in dynamics was obvious to everyone present. Kennedy packed up his materials quickly and left without his usual post-hearing media availability. Meanwhile, Crockett was surrounded by colleagues congratulating her on what many were already calling one of the best committee takedowns they had ever witnessed. One Democratic staffer was overheard saying, "I've never seen anyone do that to Kennedy before. He looked like he wanted to crawl under the table." A Republican staffer admitted, "That was brutal. She completely destroyed him with his own arguments." The hearing had been about voting rights legislation, but everyone left talking about Jasmine Crockett's masterclass in how to handle a bully who underestimates you. The immediate aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's demolition of John Kennedy was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Within minutes of the hearing ending, the political world was buzzing with excitement, shock, and analysis of what had just happened. Before Kennedy had even left the Capitol building, hashtag Crockett Destroys was trending nationwide on Twitter. The clips were spreading faster than wildfire, with political observers, journalists, and ordinary Americans sharing and resharing the moment when the tables turned so dramatically. The most viral clip, which would eventually reach over 10 million views, was the perfect 15-second summary. Kennedy condescendingly lecturing about experience, followed immediately by Crockett's devastating, "You have argued exactly 0 federal voting rights cases" response. The visual contrast was perfect. Kennedy's smug confidence melting into shocked silence. Political TikTok exploded with reaction videos. Young progressive activists were calling it the moment Gen X took down the old boys club. Legal professionals were analyzing Crockett's courtroom tactics. Even some conservative commentators had to admit it was a masterful political maneuver. One tweet that went massively viral came from a political science professor. What we just witnessed was a perfect demonstration of the difference between credential privilege and actual expertise. Kennedy had the degrees, but Crockett had the experience. Within hours, every major news network was covering the story. CNN led with, "Freshman Congresswoman dismantles veteran senator in viral exchange." MSNBC called it, "The day John Kennedy met his match." Even Fox News, despite their usual Republican lean, had to acknowledge what their own cameras had captured. The coverage wasn't just about the specific exchange. It was about what it represented. Political analysts were calling it a generational shift, a moment when the old guard's assumptions about who deserves respect and who can be dismissed were completely shattered. Rachel Maddow devoted an entire segment to breaking down Crockett's strategy. This wasn't just a good comeback. This was a lawyer setting a trap, letting her opponent walk into it, and then systematically dismantling their credibility, using their own words against them. Chuck Todd on Meet the Press called it one of the most effective pieces of political theater we've seen in years, made even more powerful by the fact that it wasn't theater at all. It was genuine expertise meeting false authority. Senator Kennedy's response to his humiliation was swift but ineffective. His office released a statement within hours. Senator Kennedy stands by his constitutional analysis and notes that experience comes in many forms beyond just specific case numbers. But the damage was done. The statement only made things worse by seeming to double down on the very credentialism that Crockett had just exposed as hollow. Political observers noted that Kennedy's usual post-hearing media appearances were canceled, and his staff was refusing to book interviews about the exchange. Kennedy did attempt one appearance on a friendly Louisiana radio show where he tried to downplay what happened. Well, that young lady certainly had her talking points prepared, but talking points don't change constitutional law. The response backfired spectacularly. Talking points became the new viral phrase, with legal experts pointing out that Crockett hadn't been reading talking points. She had been citing her actual case record from memory. For Democrats, Jasmine Crockett's performance was like finding a political unicorn. Here was someone who could go toe-to-toe with the Republicans' best debaters and not just survive but dominate. Party leadership took notice immediately. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries' statement was telling. Representative Crockett demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise and backbone we need in Congress. When Republicans try to dismiss our voices, they better come prepared for a real fight. Progressive fundraising groups reported massive spikes in donations with Crockett's name attached. Small dollar donations poured in from across the country with notes like, "Thank you for standing up to bullies." And finally, someone who fights back effectively. AOC tweeted what many were thinking. "This is how you handle condescending men in positions of power." Take notes, everyone. The Republican response was notably muted, which spoke volumes about how devastating Kennedy's loss had been. When one of your star performers gets completely outclassed, the usual response is to circle the wagons and defend them. Instead, most Republicans simply avoided commenting on the exchange altogether. Some conservative commentators tried to spin it as Democratic grandstanding, but their hearts weren't in it. When someone gets destroyed as thoroughly as Kennedy had been, it's hard to pretend otherwise. One unnamed Republican senator was quoted as saying, "John's usually sharper than that. I think he underestimated her and paid the price." The more thoughtful conservative analysis focused on the strategic error. Kennedy violated the first rule of political combat: never underestimate your opponent. He assumed he could intimidate a freshman congresswoman and instead got schooled by someone who was better prepared and more experienced in the specific area under discussion. The legal profession's response was overwhelmingly positive for Crockett. Law professors used the exchange as a teaching moment about the difference between general legal knowledge and specialized expertise. A Harvard law professor tweeted, "Perfect example of why specific experience matters more than general credentials. Crockett knew the law because she's lived it." The National Bar Association, which represents black lawyers, issued a statement praising Crockett for demonstrating the expertise and preparation that characterizes excellence in legal advocacy. Several legal blogs noted that Crockett's approach, letting Kennedy establish his own standards and then systematically showing how she exceeded them, was straight out of the courtroom advocacy playbook. Political observers noted that Crockett's performance would likely change how certain senators and representatives approach committee hearings. The old model of intimidating junior members with seniority and credentials had just been shown to be ineffective against someone properly prepared. A longtime Capitol Hill reporter observed, "This is going to make everyone think twice before they try to dismiss someone based on their freshman status." Crockett just showed that underestimating your opponent can backfire spectacularly. Committee chairs were reportedly already discussing the need to better prepare their witnesses for encounters with knowledgeable members from the opposing party. Beyond politics, the exchange resonated with millions of Americans who had experienced similar moments of being underestimated or dismissed by people in positions of authority. The comment sections were filled with stories of workplace encounters, academic situations, and professional settings where someone had used credentials to try to silence someone else's expertise. A viral Twitter thread from a young Black attorney perfectly captured the moment. "Every Black woman in corporate America just stood up and cheered. We've all been in meetings where someone tried to Kennedy us. Jasmine just showed us how to respond." Political strategists were already analyzing the long-term implications of Crockett's star-making moment. For Democrats, she represented a new model of how to effectively challenge Republican authority without seeming disrespectful or unprofessional. She didn't get angry. She didn't raise her voice. She just systematically demonstrated that she knew more about the topic than he did, noted a Democratic strategist. That's a template that other members can follow. For Republicans, the exchange served as a warning about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of actually knowing your opponent before you engage them in political combat. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on John Kennedy himself. For years, he had been one of the Republicans' most effective performers in committee hearings. His ability to make opponents look foolish had made him a valuable asset. But credibility, once lost, is hard to regain. Kennedy's future appearances would inevitably be viewed through the lens of the Crockett exchange. His signature move, using folksy charm to set up devastating questions, had been turned against him so effectively that it might never work the same way again. Several senators privately confided that the Kennedy-Crockett exchange had fundamentally changed how they approached committee preparation. One Democratic aide revealed that opposing committees were now researching every committee member's background thoroughly before hearings, afraid of walking into similar traps. Political observers noted that Kennedy seemed less aggressive in subsequent hearings, more careful about his targets, and more respectful of his opponent's potential expertise. What Jasmine Crockett accomplished in that hearing room went beyond just embarrassing John Kennedy. She established a new standard for how prepared you need to be if you're going to challenge someone in congressional hearings. Gone were the days when seniority and general credentials were enough to intimidate opponents. Crockett had shown that specific expertise, careful preparation, and strategic thinking could overcome any advantage in age, experience, or educational pedigree. By the end of that week, Jasmine Crockett had gone from a freshman congresswoman known mainly in Texas political circles to a national figure with over 1 million new social media followers and invitations to appear on every major political show. But perhaps the most telling indicator of her new status came from an unexpected source. Future witnesses appearing before congressional committees started doing much more homework on the members who would be questioning them. The Crockett effect had made everyone realize that underestimating your opponents was no longer an option. The exchange between Jasmine Crockett and John Kennedy became a case study in political communication, legal advocacy, and the power of preparation over presumption. It showed that in the modern political era, respect has to be earned through competence, not inherited through seniority. Political science programs across the country began using the footage as a teaching tool for effective legislative strategy. Law schools incorporated it into courses on courtroom advocacy and cross-examination techniques. The moment became required viewing for anyone studying how to handle hostile questioning or condescending opponents in professional settings. For millions of Americans watching, it was a perfect moment of justice. Seeing someone who had been dismissed and underestimated turn the tables completely using nothing but facts, preparation, and strategic brilliance. And for anyone who has ever been told they don't belong in a room because of their age, race, gender, or background, Jasmine Crockett's takedown of John Kennedy proved that competence and preparation can overcome any prejudice. The message was clear. Don't try to intimidate someone unless you're absolutely sure you know more than they do. Because if you're wrong, you might just create their star-making moment while destroying your own credibility in the process. If you enjoyed watching Jasmine Crockett's masterful takedown of John Kennedy, Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Political moments like this don't happen every day, but when they do, we'll break them down for you with all the details, context, and analysis you need to understand what really happened. Comment below and let us know. What was your favorite moment from this incredible exchange? Do you think this changes how politicians will approach committee hearings going forward? And who do you think might be the next veteran politician to underestimate a rising star? Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what happens when preparation meets presumption. This is the kind of political theater that reminds us why paying attention to these hearings actually matters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, where we'll cover whatever explosive political moment happens next in our increasingly dramatic political landscape.